Welcome to Book Lounge by Libby. I'm Joe, and I'm so happy you're here. We've made it to the end of week 5 of season 3, and I hope you're enjoying this season so far. This is the part of the week where we recommend books on a theme. So this week we've been celebrating Mental Health Awareness Month. If you missed it, on Monday I talked with Monica Hobson, the booked up therapist, and Dr. Susan Song about mental health, healthy habits, and the benefits of reading as a practice of self-care. Now, today I am joined by the amazing Jananie K. Velu, publisher, YouTuber, and author. Welcome back.
Hi. Thanks for having me.
Of course. Thank you for joining me today to talk mental health recs. What would you say reading plays, like what role reading plays in your own journey?
Oh, good question. I feel like I turn to books, when I need an escape, when I need to feel
Hmm.
comforted. I'm usually going through it mentally when I'm not like doing my usual routine of reading before bed and like getting into that calm space. But I also, in tough times have turned to books to like understand my life and others and understand my mind. So, yeah, books have a lot of different uses in this case.
That makes so much sense. I think of like some of the conversations from earlier in the week, just looking at the practice of self-care and how having time to read counts. Like it's as simple as that, but it's the thing we may neglect the most. Just like making time for ourselves and deserving that time and just enjoying it, and that there isn't anything beholden to it. I think of like your anti-brain rot reading challenge of just
Yeah.
the mindful practice of
Mhm.
reading, but that there are no rules or limitations to how we enjoy our books.
Yes. No, totally agree.
What have you found with the anti-brain rot that's helped you so
Mhm.
far this year?
Oh, I think it's like just that idea. I tried to base the challenge off of the concept that you can base your reading goals off of not how many pages you read or like necessarily a productivity goal, but just the time you spend. So whether that's, on the beginner mode 15 minutes or the regular mode 45 minutes, or if you want to go advanced, it's like an hour and a half,
Yeah.
setting aside that dedicated time to just chill out, to relax, to read. Funnily enough, like as someone who, does book stuff as my job,
Yeah.
like I struggle to find the time to read
Same.
or the like I think of actually inherently books and reading as like relaxation time. And so I'm just so like hyper focused on work and like, being productive that I forget that reading the books is also part of my job, but it just feels like relaxation. So I'm like, oh no, I can't, stop and do that right now.
Yes.
So remembering that is huge.
It's a huge part of why I wanted you to be here today, to
Oh, thank
just
you.
that concept alone of like it counts and we have to do it in whatever ways work for us. Because while I love the fun of a reading challenge or a reading bingo or setting a goal is really meaningful to some people, to others of us, it's the thing that will stop me in my tracks.
Yeah.
So it's one thing when I want to do like for a month, here's like the random Instagram bingo card and you're reading just in this genre, but find these subgenres. That's totally different. I can go and enjoy
Hmm.
that. But when it comes to the like, how many books do you want to read this year?
Yeah.
I
It's
don't want
always
to,
tough.
I don't want to know. I, I'm excited to see when we hit the end, how
Yeah.
many I read, but not
Mhm.
from any sort of like, what grade am I going to give myself standpoint, but just purely
Yes.
the like, whoa, it really did feel like a reading year, didn't it? So,
Yeah, and I think I've also, like, shifted my attitude towards, like, I don't need to hit a certain number each year, it matters more, the quality of what I'm reading, but also, like, since we're talking about, like, mental health and, sometimes mental illness, like, when you're going through it mentally, it is hard to stick to goals. It is hard to stick to plans because your brain does not wanna cooperate in those situations, and so I think, giving yourself grace in some respects and focusing less on those like numerical things and just giving yourself space to do the things that you care about. Yeah.
absolutely. And establishing a routine, not as a means to an end, like not as a guarantee to hit that number, like magic calculator, but instead, even as you said, like at the beginner mode for the anti-brain rot reading challenge,
Mhm.
15 minutes for yourself. And
Just a
that
cute
builds, right?
mhm, a cute 15 minutes.
A
A
cute
chill
15
15
minutes.
minutes, you know?
We all deserve it. And
Yeah.
like even just the practice of making that intentional, because I know I'm guilty of, well, I love my audiobooks. So headphones in, what else can I do? And that's still great. But the act of going like, this 15 minutes is just, even if I'm still doing audiobook, I'm
Yes.
seated and it's the
Yes.
only thing I'm doing.
Yeah,
So,
yeah, I'm guilty of that too. I'm like, audiobook while I do my makeup, audiobook while I
yeah,
fold laundry, like and that's
yeah,
great too, but sometimes you just gotta let yourself take it in.
right. And it's a great motivator for those of us
Mhm.
who may or may not be ADHD diagnosed to have that
Yes.
good drive forward. But
Yes.
yeah. So this week, we're recommending
Mhm.
books that focus or center mental health. These can be novels that one of the characters is dealing with, or kind of like in the after effects of mental health crises, overall, just dealing as a part of the story. There's a whole like gamut that we can run with this. There's also nonfiction opportunities available, so many things here. I guess here's where I'd put the like, we're talking about mental health. Please keep in mind the content. And, if you need to take space, come back to this when you're in a better place, or you can always view the full list of titles mentioned in this episode in the show notes. So do whatever works best for you. But for my list today, I decided to go all graphic novels.
Ooh,
I know.
I like
And
this.
not because I'm pushing graphic novels on people, even though I'm always pushing graphic
You so
novels on
are. I
people.
don't
I
even
am.
believe that. You have a graphic novel agenda, Joe, so let's not
I
pretend.
I do
Um,
have an agenda, but I think especially with my first one. So my first one is Puzzled by Pan Cook. This focuses on OCD, but this is specifically from Penguin Young Readers Group. This is a juvenile audience graphic novel. And I think something that's great about this is the understanding for kids who may be either getting to know a classmate who deals with whatever the situation may be, for parents to have those conversations a little easier, or just to kind of like demystify. I think graphic novels are always a great layer of access, because no matter what kind of reader you are or what stage of life you're in, I think you can find a graphic novel that will make it a little more digestible. So this is, let's just dive into it. It came out in 2024. Growing up with undiagnosed OCD sure isn't easy. And here, Pan Cook shares his own experiences with that condition in a graphic novel memoir that is as funny as it is powerfully candid and open-hearted. Pan Cook is 10 years old when anxious thoughts begin to take over his brain like pieces of an impossible puzzle. What if he blurts out a swear word while in church? What if he accidentally writes something mean in his classmates' get well card? What if his friend's racy photo of a supermodel ends up in his own homework and is discovered by his teacher? More and more, he becomes hijacked by fears that can only be calmed through exhausting, time consuming rituals. Pan has no way of knowing that this anxiety puzzle and the stressful attempts to solve it are evidence of a condition called obsessive compulsive disorder. This is his story of living with and eventually learning about OCD. Told with endearing honesty and humor, Puzzled shows the reader the importance of empathy for oneself and those going through something they don't yet understand. So, uh-huh.
that sounds amazing.
Yeah, yeah. I think there's something, again, really digestible about it, but it resonates. Like the things that, I don't know, I think a lot of it comes down to like, I'm thinking of all the parents in recent years who received their own diagnoses when they were taking their children in. And so
Yes.
I think of like, oh, we only tend to see it when we really strip it all the way back. And I think that's why this is such a
Mhm.
good fit for that.
Yeah, no, I love that, and I love that it's, like, an accessible entry into understanding it. Um, well, since you started with, sort of older YA, was it?
Juvenile.
Or
Yeah. We
juvenile,
went young.
okay.
Yeah.
So since we started young, I'll go with my 2 YA picks. I really love these books, and actually The first one I'll talk about, so Challenger Deep by Neil Shusterman, is one that I actually discovered while I was in high school, I think, by recommendation. And mind you, this was like many, many years before I was diagnosed with bipolar disorder. I got diagnosed about a few years ago, changed my whole perspective on my life because it just, pulled things into clarity. But Challenger Deep is a really cool book as well. But it centers around this main character who we are seeing in sort of two different situations. One where he is at a psychiatric hospital, I would say, amongst other patients, and he's getting to know them and trying to understand what's happened to him. And then the other timeline is that he is a sort of pirate or person on this ship, and there's a captain and there's like a parrot and there's these, kooky characters. But then you start to see how these characters coincide with the people he knows in real life in the other version of the story or timeline. And what I found really fascinating about this book was not only was it a beautiful portrayal of what this kid was going through, it sort of hints to the fact that he has some sort of schizoaffective disorder, with hallucinations, and delusions. But it was just such a human story, and he just felt like a regular kid, and I think that's
Yeah.
something that is so important to me when I'm seeing mental illness representation. It's that, very often mental illness is portrayed in a negative light as,
Mhm.
serial killers or criminals in crime shows. But this was one of those first books where I was like, oh, like this happens to regular people. Like we are, human and regular people too. And we are just going through something difficult. But what was even more cool about this book is that it also has some illustrations throughout the book that were
Love.
actually drawn by Neil Shusterman's son, who the book is based around. And
Oh,
and so I love that he sort of worked, his son's
yeah.
experience into the book, and that his son actually had a hand in it. Like he had a hand in telling his story. So yeah, it was really incredible. And then yeah, the other rec that I was gonna say that is a young adult one is Darius the Great is Not Okay by Adib Khorram. Absolutely fantastic, sort of queer up as well. But it follows a main character who is a teen and he's dealing with depression. And depression is something that's like, very often sort of like sensationalized in some respects, but like the everyday reality of depression is actually like very just
So different from
different.
whatever they
Yeah,
portray,
it's in some ways it's just exhausting. It's this
right?
like constant feeling of exhaustion. I say as someone in a current depressive episode of this bipolar disorder, I'm medicated everyone,
Yeah,
but
but still,
but
like,
you're still going
and
through the lows, yeah.
it's also important though that like you say that right here and now because it's the message of like you can do it. We're still recording this, and like we have conversations when I said to you before we started, I was like, I'm having a weird week this week. Like it
Yes.
is, it's honesty and
Mhm.
it's openness because we find the balance to still
Yes.
kind of push through, but it's not easy, and you have to start somewhere.
Yeah, and it's also like just the idea that, mental illness and mental health has been stigmatized for so long. Like
Yes.
we are so used to not talking about these issues as if mental health and mental illness is any different from any sort of physical illness. But it's the same. When you're sick and you have a cold, you tell people, "Oh, I have a cold, I can't do this," or, "I'm a little bit under the weather, but I'll try to be there," or, "I'll try to make it work, do what I can." It's the same thing. Being
The
open about
concept,
it and talking
right?
about it is okay, yeah.
And the concept of saying like, "Oh, I don't want to get anyone sick, but I still feel like I'm up to it. I'll wear a mask." We
Yeah.
don't recognize how often we're also doing that in the mental health space
Mhm.
because again,
Yeah.
it's a mask that no one can see.
Yeah, yeah. It's an unseen thing, and that's part of the difficulty of it, and I think, the more
Yeah.
we talk about it, the more other people feel seen. So yeah, I loved Darius the Great because it was one of those moments where it was like a very regular, sort of innocuous representation of depression and how he's moving through this, and he's going through these new life experiences, but he's trying to make the most of it, and he's still going on. So I appreciated
Oh,
that.
and it's so beautiful. And now I'm just thinking of like all of these things we don't talk about, it's also so easy to get caught up in what words mean and what our expectations of things are. Like you said, the caricature of anything of a schizoaffective disorder when you're talking about like either the concept of they're unstable, they're unsafe, they're all of these things, they're the killer in Criminal
Mhm.
Minds,
Mhm.
or they live in a world beyond our reach.
Yes.
Same thing with OCD. I mean,
Yeah.
with my first pick, there's so much portrayed to that. But I learned recently that like, oh, I have medical OCD. That if
Mhm.
it's got to do with symptoms or any form of like checklists medically,
Yeah.
I'm gonna be stuck in a loop or two. And
Mhm.
I always figured because I didn't meet the check boxes of, like,
Yes.
I don't experience it in any of the other ways. And I don't have a magic number to flip the light switch. Like, because this is what we see portrayed for OCD. Like, because I don't have that fix that they say all these OCD people have, which, turns out I'm one of them.
Mhm.
We don't understand that there are these borderlines.
Yeah, yeah. I think we often we see a list of symptoms, especially when it comes to mental illness, and we think if we don't hit them specifically or to the extreme that, it's listed, we think it's not us. But I think there's so many mental illness again is also a bit of a spectrum in most cases. There's people with much more severe cases and less severe, and you know, s- treatment plans also
Right.
vary across people. So, yeah, no, I
Right.
totally feel that. I totally
We're
feel that.
just finally starting to talk thoughtfully about mental illness.
Mhm.
And we are nowhere near ready yet to understand that it's a
Yes.
spectrum, apparently.
Yeah. Yeah, everything's a spectrum, guys. That's the moral of this
Everything.
story.
Right.
Nothing is black and white.
Not everything is shades of gray. Get used to it.
Mhm. Mhm.
My next pick, though, I think in that same invisible illness category is a story of chronic pain. And while that is not what you may be thinking of, dear listener, as a mental health i- issue or representation in this case, um, daily pain, chronic pain, pain that you cannot explain or speak into existence or whatever to people has so many impacts on life. And I think this was just my attempt to be like, let's see all sides here. So this is What's Wrong by Aaron Williams. Also came out in 2024. So it's an utterly riveting, deeply moving, absolutely molecule rearranging exploration of pain, individual and collective, suffused with wit, wonder, and mourning, textured by compassion and curiosity, and vibrating with the humanity of its dynamic subjects. Williams' sharp, nimble, tender prose and her searing art, humming with insight and imagination, speak to veins of human experience so difficult to articulate we often shy away from speaking them at all. But in these dark places, she finds vitality, collectivity, and hope. This book and its subjects will live inside me forever. And that's a quote from Leslie Jameson, author of The Empathy Exams. So, looking at it itself, What's Wrong is author, illustrator, and scientific researcher Aaron Williams' graphic exploration of how the American healthcare system fails us. Focusing on four raw and complex firsthand accounts, plus Williams' own story, this book examines the consequences of living with interconnected illnesses and conditions like immunodeficiency, cancer, endometriosis, alcoholism, severe depression, PTSD, Western medicine, which intends to cure illness and minimize pain, often causes more loss, abuse, and suffering for those who don't fit within the narrow definition, as we were saying, who the system was built to serve. And that is, of course, cis, white, heterosexual men. So the book explores the many ways in which those receiving medical care are often overlooked, unseen, and doubted by the very clinicians who are supposed to heal them. What's Wrong is also a beautiful celebration of non traditional modes of healing, of how we become whole, not because of healthcare, but despite it.
Oh my god, I need to read
Uh-huh.
this now. I
Yes.
was, nodding along as you were saying this because 'cause I'm like, "Oh, I feel this."
Yeah. Yeah, it's a big one. I mean, like, I think aside from the fact that like we don't often think of chronic pain and the impact that that has on ourselves, on our friends, um, it also looks at so many other elements of just the system. So I
Yeah,
I think
yeah.
I think if you're like I tend to read for escape, so I feel like today I had to do a list different from what I'd usually do.
Yeah.
Um, so instead of going very escapism, I was like, if you want to just dive into a little bit more, here we go.
Yeah, yeah, that's such a great rec, and I love that it delves into, like, the healthcare system too. One thing I always talk about with people, I live in Canada, so, free healthcare in theory,
Free.
but,
Yeah.
like, when it comes to mental health, like, getting care is actually very hard, and especially diagnoses, especially in the province that I live in. It took, like, almost a year to get the actual, like, final diagnosis from a psychiatrist,
Wow.
and even then there was, like, the barriers with family doctors and,
Yeah.
like, other practitioners. Because you're not the extreme case, they don't think that you fit the bill, which can also be a frustrating experience, and, with chronic pain, that's also something, like, the fact that you're never believed.
Right. That it's the like, oh, well, clearly this is endemic of something else. This is
Yeah.
seeking, this is whatever, instead of just like, let's look holistically at you as a person and see what's going on.
Yeah, yeah. No, that's a great one.
But also
Um
love having the Canadian perspective to be like, free healthcare doesn't mean it's perfect up here.
Yeah, there's access issues and there's, people without family doctors and they can't get those referrals and like there's so many things that go into this.
Right. Then
And
you've got long waits and
yeah,
yeah.
s- systemic issues.
Right.
Um
Imagine that broken system. Hmm.
I actually just thought of another rec that I didn't even put on the list, but I have so many. But I'm gonna talk about What My Bones Know by Stephanie Fu, which is a memoir by the author. And it's such an incredible book. She's also a great writer. But Stephanie Fu writes this memoir about her experience trying to find a diagnosis and also treatment for her what she ends up figuring out to be complex PTSD, because of a lot of trauma that she went through as a child, and she kind of unpacks that. She unpacks, her career and her struggle with her mental health and mental illness. And what was even more fascinating was like she even includes, some conversations with her psychiatrist. And if you listen to the audiobook, actually, she recorded, I believe, those sessions. Like I vaguely remember like hearing, her psychiatrist's voice as well.
Wow.
And it was so fascinating to me to hear some of these things. And I think for her, what was really difficult throughout the situation was, not only finding just general like mental health care, but complex PTSD is a specific, condition that's just not understood very well. And so trying to diagnose that and figure that out was extremely difficult. And it was something that kind of defied explanation in some scenarios. So it was a really fascinating, memoir. And like although it has some difficult parts, I think it was very engaging and like a really great read as well. So if you're someone who's into nonfiction memoirs, like great one.
I think we also, again, like we have such a concept of what PTSD looks like. And even when you hit medical professionals,
Yes.
there are, we're still always fighting the like everyday stimuli to not be like,
Mhm.
okay, but you didn't have this one big, well, that's what makes it
Yes.
complex. Like
Yes.
PTSD, right? Usually the inciting incident, CPTSD, long term
Yeah.
exposure, even if it is low grade exposure.
Mhm. Yeah, yeah, yeah. It's so funny that we're like talking about, even healthcare practitioners who don't kind of understand the concept or it doesn't fit the specific description, so they don't think it's that thing. And I remember like when I first was saying, oh, I think I might have bipolar disorder, and I was explaining this to my sister who was in, a medical profession. And she was like, but you're not like these other people like that, I see at the hospital or that, I deal with on a daily. And it's because, she's seeing mostly the extreme cases.
Right.
So yeah, there's just so much that goes into it. And yeah, no, complex PTSD, it was, like, really fascinating to learn about it, and it challenged my own perception of, like, what I thought PTSD was as well, so that I also appreciated the book for that.
Absolutely. I shared this in Monday's episode, but like my friend and I will often, like compare notes after sessions, and I'll be like, girl, guess what I just learned? And she'll be like, friend, if you are getting that, there's no way I don't, like,
Yeah.
because it's that constant, like, if you don't laugh, you'll cry, but also
Mhm.
challenging what we've always known. Just the like,
Yeah.
to me, I didn't think I could ever have lowercase or capital letter T trauma. Like it was
Mhm,
just,
mhm.
oh, whatever. But like,
Yeah.
shocker, we can all have trauma.
Yeah, I think, sometimes, people will be like, everyone goes through that, like, it's not that big of a deal, and it's like,
Yeah.
maybe we all yeah,
M maybe we all
need
need to, like, pause and look and go, "Oh,
yeah,
uh-oh."
yeah, yeah.
My next pick, actually released today. It's called Anxiety Land by Gemma Corral. The title alone got me, and the illustration style is very charming. But, like, oh, so in 2018, Gemma had a panic attack that lasted for weeks on end. Unable to do much more than walk aimlessly through the streets of Berkeley, Coral admitted herself to a mental hospital to reckon with the bad feeling that had been her companion since she was a child. With her ingenious and charming illustrations bursting with personality, peppered with witty asides, Coral leads readers through the amusement park in her own mind, featuring severe anxiety, depression, agoraphobia, and dissociation, a frightening and darkly funny world that feels like a place apart from real life. It's a hilarious thrill ride exploring the mysteries of the mind body connection. Gemma Correll's graphic memoir is shot through with the absurd knowledge that there is no linear way through anxiety land, nor any cure alls, but there are ways to feel better if you keep trying to move forward. Yeah, that line really speaks to me because I think that's like the things that I think we should all try to remember is that like progress isn't linear.
Yes.
It's just kind of about like every step forward you take, you're also pulling your safety net with you. So you can never backslide back further. Like you can never go all the way back. Like the progress isn't irreversible. There's always hope forward. But also, right,
Absolutely.
there's no cure-alls, and all we have to do
Yeah.
is keep trying. I dealt with agoraphobia after the pandemic. I
Oh,
think
yeah.
I traveled so much prior to, like, was canceling tickets, was about to get on a plane, like, days before the world shut
Yeah.
down, um, and then didn't didn't go anywhere other than, like, the grocery store or to my friends until 2023.
Yeah.
So,
Oh my
like
gosh, yeah. That's tough.
yes. So it was just kind of like eye-opening, and
Mhm.
I'm always interested to see what other people experienced because it's just that like that strange understanding that I wanna I don't know, like there's a part of me that's like, I wanna see it for her, but I also want to see what I can like reconcile in my own mind of like,
Mhm.
"Oh, yeah, that is kinda like that." But yeah, that
Yeah.
is Anxiety Land by Gemma Corral.
Damn, that sounds amazing. Yeah. Thank you for sharing that. That's
And again, like,
everyone. Yeah.
like, graphic novels, even if you haven't read them, most of these are graphic memoirs, which are like, most accessible version of a graphic novel, and I think for I hate the genre title, but, like, tough topics, uh,
Mm. Yeah.
like but for things that are
Yeah.
meaty to digest, it is, I think, a good way to do it. I'm not saying I
Yeah.
had a plan, but
No, I agree. It's such an accessible format. And I love that. Okay. I can't
I know
decide what I wanna
you've
go
got so
next.
many, and
Okay,
believe me,
okay.
at some point, I'm just gonna let you go wild.
I could go on and on and on. Actually, it's funny you say this because, I think a lot of people don't wanna go deep into some of the darker topics, but I remember saying this in a video where I was, like, recommending a bunch of books and someone had commented, they were like, "I appreciate how you, like, talk about all these difficult topics, like, you know, with, like, a smile on you're just
Yes.
is talking about it, and it gave them comfort in some senses." And I guess, I'll go with my next rec, which is a bit of a funny one. It's a bit of a satire, and it's Big Swiss by by Jen Beacon. And the reason I like this book, also it gives me similar vibes or satirical vibes as My Year of Rest and Relaxation by Otessa Moshfegh, which you put on your list. So
I
I'm
did.
stealing it for a second here.
Please steal it because it's in the section that's like, oh, I'm putting it here, but I went all graphic novels. So it's yours, Jananie.
Okay, we want you to stay on theme, so it's mine. Okay. So Big Swiss and then also My Year of Rest and Relaxation are, this genre of literary fiction satire that I absolutely adore, which uses a humorous tone for some very difficult things, actually. Which I remember, saying in that video where someone had commented, I was like, it gives me comfort in some sense to read about, you know, dark, difficult topics like, depression or things that really plague me, but watch characters be ridiculous and, be messy,
Yeah.
sometimes messier than me, sometimes not as messy as me. And like, they're just living life and they're dealing with it. And we don't always need to talk about mental health and mental illness in a serious and, like, oh, it's such a sad, dark topic. Like, no, this is something
Yes.
that people go through on the daily. And, we can, I think, those of us with any sort of depressive tendencies, we have that dark humor. That's partially how we cope. And so, yeah, both of these books were that. Big Swiss follows a main character who is, I think, in her 40s, Greta. And she has like sort of restarted her entire life, moved to a new city, and she is working as a transcriber for a sex therapist. I'm sure you weren't expecting that twist. And the sex therapist wants to write a book about, his practice and like how he works with his patients or whatever. So she's transcribing these sessions and she starts to essentially fall in love with one of the patients while she listens to her sessions. It's also queer. She lovingly nicknames this patient Big Swiss. And
Which love.
starts
Like,
yeah, it's a kooky, weird book. Also it goes on like
my
crazy
fave.
tangents. She has a crazy landlord. There are dogs involved. She starts sort of using the things that she knows from the sessions to sort of find her way into Big Swiss's life outside of the sessions.
Yikes.
But it's messy, but like you see her heart in all of it, and obviously it's all going to unravel and be very chaotic by the end. But I think one of the interesting things about that book was she was a slightly older character who hadn't yet figured everything out and was sort of starting over, but then being messy about it and not fully understanding where her own mind was at. And I think it was one of those situations where like you see a character who suppresses so many things and then it eventually comes out and she has to deal with it. And seeing her reckon with all of that was really interesting and beautiful. And then I'll just quickly talk
Go for
about
it.
My Year of Rest and Relaxation. That one's also funny. It's also that I would say it's even more absurd.
I agree. It's
Yeah,
definitely more which
yeah,
I love weird books.
yeah. Me too. I always like love looking at the reviews of that book because people are always like, "What was the point of this? This was so weird. I don't get it."
It's how I
Um,
know I'm gonna love a book. Like,
yeah,
if someone tells me, "Oh, this book is weird," and I go on Goodreads and I see what other people are saying
yeah.
about it, and they're like, "I didn't get it." I'm like, "Ooh,
This is gonna
I'm
be
ready. I'm locked
good.
in. This is for me. Got it. You didn't understand it? Ready."
Yeah, I remember seeing it go viral on TikTok and I was like, what's the big deal about this book?" And then I realized what the actual concept was, which is that we follow this sort of privileged young white woman in New York in the early 2000s, and we are following her as she decides to, with the help of her crazy psychiatrist, I say crazy in the term of like she's doing crazy
Right.
shit,
Yeah.
in in the sense that she's prescribing all of these outrageous medications that the main character asks for so that she can essentially sleep an entire year of her life away, My Year of Rest and Relaxation, because she is so depressed. And
Yeah.
she is hoping, like every single one of us who deals with depressive, situations, that at the end of all this, after all of that sleep, she'll be able to wake up and she will feel better again. And that was a concept that I was like, that nothing has ever spoken to me as just as beautifully as that. So, but it's crazy and it's
Yeah.
absurd. And she's also a character who's like not the most sympathetic person. She comes with a lot of privilege, and there's a bit of commentary in that, but also you can feel some sympathy for this character, even though they're an unlikable character, and you can resonate with some of that. Yeah.
Right. The core of satire in both of these books of like, oh, if only a year's worth of sleep could fix me. It is what it comes down to. And I think that's what ends up being so beautiful a lot about this. But I also want to go back to what you said earlier. It's hard when we sit down for some conversations when I'm like, how do I walk into this room carefully? Because right,
Right.
we never want to be insensitive. We never want to
Mhm.
come across like diminishing, but I think the fact that we hold those concerns is what keeps us from doing those things.
Yes. Yes.
But right, I think for you and I both, it's kind of like I said, if I'm not laughing, I'm crying, and so
Yeah.
I want to be laughing. Like
I want it.
so much of this is just we need to talk about these things because people need to hear it, they need to see it, but also like you can't sleep away a year of your life. The only thing that makes it better is living every day, even when those days are hard. So I think like just the act of pushing joy into it or like
Mhm.
smile, laugh, because right, yeah, of course we describe that doctor as crazy in the mental health episode
Yeah.
because it's true.
Yeah, and there's so much stigma around mental illness, and we also have,
Mhm.
these markers in our language, like you were saying, with the word crazy or insane or whatever else.
What we use like
Um,
kid gloves for and like the
yeah.
thought of all of my lighting being very dim right now and just kind of being like hello and welcome, and we use
Yeah.
NPR voices and like and we don't bring the usual energy, and everyone goes, well, I got good recs, but like that was weird, like
Yeah.
you
It
know.
just yeah, and I think it speaks to, like, the whole, we wanna, in some ways, like, normalize or just show how this is a normal part of people's lives, and, touching it with, like, a 10-foot pole is not gonna give you that sense.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Because while I'm giving the books of like if you want to empathize more because these are kind of like the straight story of this thing, you are bringing the like these are just normal people.
Mhm.
Which that's the important like, we don't want any of this to feel like a forced narrative. It's just the
Yeah.
like and this main character did this whole thing even though they have insert condition here.
Yeah. Yeah, and it also just speaks to, like,
Yeah.
people with mental illness can be main characters, and they can also have really funny and kooky stories, like, there is range.
Exactly.
Yeah.
There is range. Speaking of range, my next pick is Dear Scarlet by Teresa Wong. This one came out in 2019 and it is a story of postpartum depression. I feel like you and I talked about this last week as well, where it's just the like, there's so much that we never seem to talk about. And I think this is one of those. It's an intimate and moving graphic memoir where Wong writes and illustrates the story of her struggle with postpartum depression in the form of a letter to her daughter, Scarlett. Equal parts heartbreaking and funny, Dear Scarlet perfectly captures the quiet desperation of those suffering from postpartum depression and the profound feelings of inadequacy and loss. As Teresa grapples with her fears and anxieties and grasps at potential remedies, coping mechanisms, and her mother's Chinese elixirs, we come to understand one woman's battle against the cruel dynamics of postpartum depression. We're not out here talking about this enough. Like
Yeah. Yeah.
uh, this to me, I think is so important. And I think, again, like new parents in your life, they both need to read it. And families who are welcoming young family members in, you need to read it as well. Like we just need to be a little more understanding. So
Yes. Yeah, yeah, yeah. I think, everything around sort of pregnancy and children and then, the very sad reality of, infant
Mhm.
deaths or
Right.
miscarriages or all of these different things that are very much very, very common things that happen to people
Right.
on the regular. They're, like, kind of not talked about and shied away from because they're sad topics, and there's no denying that, but I think not talking about them also increases the, inability for people to understand and empathize and sort of give you that grace and space.
Yeah, because it's the same with postpartum of, like, there was no loss here. This is just something your body is doing in the aftermath, and everything around you is like, "Oh, well, TV tells us, of course you're gonna be tired because having a baby is exhausting." Like, we've
Yeah.
made such a caricature of it
Yeah.
that it then makes it so difficult for people to get help or to just know that, like, hey, yeah, you're going to feel some version of tired, but you might not feel this. And that's something to be
Mhm.
mindful of.
Yeah, yeah, it's just, like, something to be aware of, like, I think a lot of people don't know all of these, different things related to pregnancy and birth and
Right.
all of
And
that,
and
and
as you're saying
it's
loss, like there's
yeah.
so much that's like tabooed.
Yes. Yeah. Yeah. No, that's a great one. Actually, on that note, I will give 2 quick recs. Contemporary fiction. So one was one that I mentioned, in a previous week, which was Cleo Dang Would Rather Be Dead by Mein Nguyen, which features a main character who, loses her baby at full term. But, it's the main character dealing with the aftermath of that, and she, goes to work at a funeral home to deal with her grief. And then another one is Before I Let Go by Kennedy Ryan, which features oh, I forget if this is a spoiler, but, I mean, if you're going into it, like, content warning, like
Right.
miscarriage,
Yeah.
and how the loss of a child can also drive apart a relationship, a very strong relationship, and that one's actually a second chance romance, and it's very, very beautiful. But it's characters who are overcoming this trauma and,
Hmm.
working through that. But I wanted to actually, because I just finished Cleo Dang, and there's this really beautiful line in the book. The main character is Vietnamese Canadian, and um there's this saying in Vietnamese where instead of saying, like, in English we say, like, "Oh, I'm so sorry for your loss," whatever it is. The saying in Vietnamese is a parting your sorrow. Like, I will take on a part of your
Oh.
sorrow and grief and share it with you, because so much of dealing with grief
Hmm.
is, getting through it is the community around you who helps you through it. And I think
Right.
that's such a important thing. In both cases, it was like not necessarily characters dealing with a mental illness specifically, but they went through very, very difficult experiences that took a toll on their mental health that could drive them into situations where, they need medication or, additional help or whatever else. And those are situations that are very common and a lot of people deal with. And knowing that, it's normal and that you have people around you to share that sorrow with you who care is so important. Yeah.
And I think you're exactly right. There's such a big part here of some of my upcoming picks, but also what you've shared so far of us being able to say, like, there isn't always a diagnosis tied
Mm,
to what your mental health is doing from like time to time. I mean, our recs, because writing, just in the same way that any form of storytelling, film, television, has to emphasize to some degree to get the point across, or it makes more narrative sense when, like in that instance, one tragic thing happens or has condition from birth or, any number of things. But it's really important to be mindful of, like, it's good to read these not just for understanding, but so you can give yourself the empathy and maybe also the help you may need
yeah.
one day or needed in the past. Like, it's
Yeah.
visibility across the board. You don't have to have the, like, diagnosis to
Yeah,
need these
yeah.
books.
And actually in the instance of both of these books, it was interesting because both characters, make the sort of observation that they never thought that this thing would happen to them. And I think that that is something that so many people think, you always think that you're gonna be the exception to the rule, that, you don't need the but there's people who don't wanna, pay the taxes that cover disability and, like, whatever else insurance and, like,
I don't
um
need that. I'll never need it.
yeah,
Yeah.
I'll never need that. You never know what life is going to hit you with,
Ever.
ever, and having, that empathy and perspective into other people, but also, like,
Right.
people deal with this on a regular basis, and you should, you know, I think just understand that as well. Yeah.
This may be like a gross, like oversimplification, but like a lot of people in California who have earthquake kits hope to never have to use it. And if you are not struggling with your mental health, I still hope you'll consider some of these books so that way you
Yes.
have the tools already in the toolbox. Like this is an
Yes.
opportunity to build your mental preparedness.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. It was definitely like I turned to some of these books after the fact of
Yeah.
realizing like what I was going through.
Yeah.
Um, but I had that at least reference point, which was so important.
Right. And generally, this episode doesn't necessarily tie with the message earlier this week of like find what distracts you and use reading as like a fun escape, but it also blends with the concept of just like we're learning, we're empathizing,
Mhm.
we're building awareness. So a little bit of everything for everyone this week. I next want to go into anxiety and generational trauma. So I think a lot of us can kind of agree with anxiety in the world we live in. But generational trauma is, I think, something very interesting to get the chance to look at. And this is Past Tense by Sasha Mardu. This came out in 2024. And it's a brave and captivating graphic memoir about the power of therapy to heal anxiety and generational trauma. When Sasha turned 40 years old, she was leading a life that looked perfect on the outside, happily married to the love of her life, enjoying motherhood and her 6-year-old daughter, and her first book had just been published. But for reasons she couldn't explain, the anxiety that had always plagued her only seemed to be getting worse, and then, without warning, she began breaking out in terrible acne. The product of a stoic, working class British family, Sasha had deep seated distrust of the mental health treatment. But now, living the life she'd built in the US and desperate for relief, she finds herself in a therapist's office for the first time. There, she begins the real work of growing up, learning to understand her family of origin and the childhood trauma she thought she'd left hidden in the past, but is still entangled in her present life. Past Tense takes us inside Sasha's therapy sessions, which over time become life changing. She begins to come to terms with her turbulent and complicated upbringing, which centered around her now estranged father, who had a violent relationship with her mother, and would then later go to prison for sexually abusing her stepsister. With her therapist's guidance, she sees how these wounds and other generational trauma has been passed through her family as far back as her grandmother's experiences during the Blitz of World War II. And she discovers modalities that powerfully shape her healing along the way, including the work of Bessel van der Kolk and Richard Schwartz, known as internal family systems. As Sasha's emotional life begins to unfreeze and she lets go of the shame she's long held, she realizes that the work she's doing and her love for her family can ripple outward too, changing her relationships now and creating a new legacy for her daughter. Bravely told, visceral, and profoundly moving, Past Tense is a story about our power to break free of the past once and for all and find hope. Uh-huh.
That's beautiful. Oh my god.
Yeah. It's worth picking up. I think if you because to one of your earlier books of the like it's a person in her 40s, like
Mhm.
there is no too late to make a change in your life. And I
Mhm.
think, again, if you feel any sort of like resistance to the idea of like, well, I love that for you, but not for me,
Mm.
this might help you see just a little differently.
Yeah. No, absolutely. Um, I'm gonna do a little
Yeah,
pivot or similar one.
go for it.
It's a nonfiction, and it's one that I discovered while I was actually really, really, really struggling. It's called How to Keep House While Drowning by Casey Davis. I believe the author does content on social media, whatever, but I actually didn't discover the book through that. I was watching another booktuber's video who actually I will talk about later in this episode. But she had recommended this book because it's just like a very short sort of self-help. I say that in like quotation marks because it's really just this very simple, easy, quick book. The audiobook's fantastic. I think it's like 45 minutes or something. And it's just full of all these like amazing tips and tricks for how to keep house while you are mentally drowning.
Yes,
Um, when
please.
you are unable to, fold all of the laundry or, every week or do your usual upkeep or whatever. There's so many things that go into the everyday of life that are so exhausting. And when you're mentally struggling, when you're stressed out, like there are so many things that just fall to the wayside. And this is, one of those books that helps you learn different systems and just easy ways to continue doing those things even when you feel like you can't. And I think, it was a huge thing for me because I was really struggling at the time. And I literally couldn't bring myself to do some of the things that, she was talking about in the book, just like the regular upkeep stuff. We've all had those like moments when you're like really stressed out or you're really upset or you're, emotionally going through something like you don't want to get out of bed, you don't want to brush your hair or change your clothes. You just want to like, sit in a corner and just like hermit or whatever it is. And sometimes, if you're a parent, you have to continue showing up for your kids, for other people in your life. And, if you're in a relationship, like figuring out how to show up in that relationship or finding ways to get the people in your life to help you out when you're struggling. Like with me and my partner, like very often, if I'm struggling, like he's just making the house like work without me even
Yes.
realizing it. And if he's going through something, like I try to pick up things and it's, being there for people in this sort of community aspect and recognizing that not everyone's going to be on top of their game or operating at like top performance.
Absolutely. I mean, and also like, I don't know, I can never underestimate the power of a hug. There are there are plenty of times where my boyfriend will just come and give me a hug. Like he'll be on his way to work and I'll be like, "Hey, do you have 15 minutes?" And and it's just that. But it's
Yeah.
also the same thing of like, "Oh, sometimes we needed to both break out of the funk and like all it
Hmm.
was that the activity we did that night was the laundry because we
Okay.
just got to like stand there and chit chat back and forth."
Yeah. Yeah.
So, yeah, there's power in the mundane.
Very. I mean, I'm sure every child of immigrants who's listening to this can relate to your parents being like, just take a walk. You'll feel better. And it's so irritating to hear in the moment. I agree. The amount of times my mom will be like, why don't you get outside and take a walk? You'll feel better. I'm like, Ma, you're minimizing my trauma, my what I'm going through, whatever. And then I'm like, I just need to get out and I'll put on my earphones and I'll walk out in the sun and I'm like, I suddenly feel a little bit better. And there's a reason they say these things. It's because when you don't have a language for how to deal with, these
Mhm.
things, when, there's so much stigma around it. And a lot of people, back in the day when there wasn't any like treatment options really,
Right.
the thing you did was go outside and walk
Take a walk.
and take a walk, do some exercise, get
Yep.
some sun. And these are all things that, send body cues to our brain that, like, okay, you're going to be okay. You just need to, so it's
Right.
obviously not going to solve everything, but
But
it's
from like
not
the
going to
base
hurt.
right, and from like the baseline of endorphins releasing because
Hmm.
exercise is happening to distraction is happening because now all of a sudden you've
Yes.
taken your like, "Oh,
You're
did the
outside of your
temp
head.
did the temperature change from inside to outside?" Like, all of these small things to just break. Like, I tend to deal with a lot of somatic symptoms with my anxiety, and so it's usually the, like, walk to the freezer and put an ice cube in your palm. Oh, that's just different. Like, just something to change the course of whatever, pop a sour candy in your mouth, whatever is like an
Hmm.
immediate shock to your system to bump you out of that space.
Yeah.
Like you said, get out of your
Get you out of the
head.
funk.
Hmm. But also, boy, oh boy, the amount of wonderful children of immigrants this week that I have seen on my TikTok saying, I'm telling you to take a walk because I'm tired of hearing it, but they're right. I'm just, as you're sitting there, I'm like,
Truly.
wow, directly delivered to me. Go take a walk.
Yeah.
Okay.
It's like one of those things where as you get older, you're like, wow,
Uh-huh.
like my parents were right. Or like mom was right, you know?
I And I know my mother's best friend, Hygiena, is listening right now. You can tell her I said this, but I am turning into my mother left and right.
Yeah, same.
And honestly, I smile. Like I have moments where I go, "Oh God, I'm turning into my mother," and then I smile after. like
Yeah.
there's worse people.
Yeah,
So
literally.
every time I'm like, "So babe, what do you want for dinner?" And he goes, "Why are you asking me?" And I'm like, "Oh my God, I'm being paid back what I gave to her."
Truly, oh my god. Oh, so good.
So my last pick before I let you go, like hog wild and just shout out however many you want, but also listeners, I will put Jananie's full list, even of books that we did not get to mention in today's episode, in the description. So you can check out everything that she was recommending. But my last pick, I'm hoping this kind of bridges the gap a little bit because it deals with ennui. And ennui is, it's a French word, but there's also the flip side of like how we perceive it in mental health is that it tends to be, like if we were just talking in French right now, just I'm bored. But in the kind of mental health space, it's beyond boredom. It's soul sucking. It's fatigue with a lack of motivation. You're irritable. There's difficulty concentrating. There is a link to depression. It's like persistent apathy and overall disengagement. But while it's not a specific state of mental illness, it can be telling of things, whether it's just kind of like a moment in your life or underlying mental health issues like depression or anxiety. So I'm hoping this is a bit of a bridge for those of you who like may just have rough seasons or you're trying to understand it. So this is In by Will McPhail, came out in 2021. It's very well lauded, but it is a poignant and witty graphic novel by a leading New Yorker cartoonist following a millennial's journey from performing his life to truly connecting with people. Nick, a young illustrator, can't shake the feeling that there is some hidden realm of human interaction beyond his reach. He haunts look-alike, fussy, silly coffee shops, listens to old Joni Mitchell albums too loudly, and stares at his navel in hope that he will find whatever it is in there. But it isn't until he learns to speak from the heart that he begins to find authentic human connections and is let in to the worlds of the people he meets. Nick's journey occurs alongside the beginnings of a relationship with Ren, a wry, spirited oncologist at a nearby hospital, whose work and life becomes painfully tangled with Nick's. Illustrated in both color and black and white, in McPhail's instantly recognizable style, In elevates the graphic novel genre. It captures his trademark humor and compassion with a semi-autobiographical tale that is equal parts hilarious and heart-wrenching, uncannily appropriated for our isolated times. So I think this is a really good look at just ennui. Like at this time, this was coming out amidst the pandemic, but I think we still
Mhm.
feel the like aftershocks of
Oh, yeah.
isolation.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah.
I feel like there's just so much that could be said, and I yeah, because everyone was knocked out of their routines and it was a overall global thing that was affecting so many people, so, yeah, I'm sure we will see more effects, in the coming years, yeah.
Right. And I think everyone should take a moment to be like, what changed for you in that
Mhm.
time when we were kind of like in lockdown? Because, if you went from being a shower everyday person to the like, oh, I will when there's a need, that's a
Mhm.
big shift in who you
Yeah.
are as a person that many of us just went with the like, well, everyone's doing it. So there are all sorts of little benchmarks we can think of, but I think this it's really gorgeous. And I think that same kind of like listlessness
Mhm.
and identifying, I don't know, just identifying something that has heft to it
Yeah.
that we really don't talk about because it's hard enough to put words to.
Yeah, yeah, it's one of those, like, things that's just so hard to describe or
Yeah.
convey,
Yeah.
and a lot of, mental health and mental illness struggles sometimes is, like, you don't have a reason for the way you feel necessarily. We talked about, like, mental health struggles that come out of some sort of trauma or, event or repeated trauma or whatever it is. But there's a lot, on the mental illness side that there is no reason for why you're depressed or why you're, dealing with whatever it is. And the fact that you can't point to something and be like, this is the reason breeds such, you know,
Like
it's just so
resentment
hard to,
almost. Like
yeah,
there's so
yeah,
many like missing words for that because right, aside from
yeah.
like, oh, that might just be the way you're wired. There's
Mhm.
also like
Yeah.
sometimes it just came from truly a
Mhm.
handful of factors that may not have had a lasting impact where you can go, there's the
Yes.
root. It's just the like, how do we work past this and into like a better coped life? So right. And it can be very difficult when you don't have like a face to point your finger in to just be like, this is your fault. Like,
Yeah.
I
And
don't
I
know.
think it's also like why people struggle to understand people with mental illness as well. It's like
Yeah.
like my mom will sometimes say like, what do you have to be sad about?" And and then I have to be like, "My brain chemistry."
I know. Don't you think that makes me feel even worse?
Yeah.
Because
Yeah.
that's
And
the hardest thing to explain sometimes is just to like,
mhm.
I'm more mad at myself for feeling this way than about
Mhm.
the way I feel. Thank you very
Yeah.
much.
And I, even when my mom says that, it's not out of a place of like,
Exactly.
trying to be mean or whatever. They just want to understand. And I think there's so many things in life where we think, oh, I need to have that. We want to be able to point at the thing, like you said, and like blame it on this thing, and or find the right root cause so that you can cure the thing. But sometimes, there is nothing, and this is just something that we live with and deal with.
Right.
But with that, I'm gonna go through a little rapid fire
Go
of some
for
of
it.
my last few recs. Okay, so we talked a lot about, sort of real life stories and like memoirs and other stuff, but I have a couple fantasy recs because we can have mental illness rep in fantasy as well. And also, there's some beautiful metaphors in fantasy for what people go through with mental illness and mental health. So I have to shout out my dear friend Cindy Pham, who is a booktuber who has her first debut novel coming out in June, which is The Secret World of Briar Rose. It is a sapphic YA fantasy, and it is sort of a retelling of Sleeping Beauty, but from this concept, which, Cindy deals with major depressive disorder, and she's talked about this online multiple times. But this was sort of, her answering the question of, well, what if Sleeping Beauty went to sleep because she just wanted to sleep and, have it all end?
It's so good. Like,
Which
what a
the second
concept.
she told me that, I was
Yeah.
like, this is me. I
Yep.
need this book. But yeah, it's very cool because it features, these two characters who kind of delve into this sort of secret world, and it turns out that this is like the subconscious of the Sleeping Beauty, quote unquote, character, who seems to have some secrets and things lingering in her subconscious that she doesn't even understand. And they meet the character of Briar Rose, which is sort of like her alter ego. So it's very, very fascinating. And yeah, I'm just so excited for it to come out. And then the other fantasy rec that I have is one of my absolute all-time favorites, which is An Academy for Liars by Alexis Henderson. I love Alexis Henderson's books. I think I've recommended them before as well, but this one is sort of a dark academia, fantasy, and a little bit of a horror. But this is like the fantasy book that I wish I had like as a teen growing up, but like it's an adult novel. And it follows a main character named Lennon who is in college and is dealing with, obviously some sort of mental illness, and she's struggling. And I saw so much of myself in Lennon because I had dealt with similar stuff in my early 20s coming out of college, and this feeling that like, you know, y- your struggle with mental health and mental illness sort of robs you of time in your life. A lot of us talk about how like the pandemic
Mhm.
robbed us of, certain years and whatever, but that's a lot of what mental illness feels like, especially if you deal with depression or bipolar
Absolutely.
disorder, where you are going through these long bouts of time where you are unable to, feel like yourself, and you lose yourself in that time. And sometimes you lose yourself in relationships, in, the things that you're doing at the time. You're not able to, perform at your potential in some senses, you know? And I remember going through a lot of university and being like, a lot of those years I don't remember because I was struggling so much. And an Academy for Liars, follows Lennon as she's, in this very difficult situation, and she gets this very unique opportunity. She's approached by these mysterious people who invite her to, join this academy where basically people get a second chance at life and they learn the power of persuasion. It's like, this type of magic. And if they, succeed at this academy, they'll have all of this sort of access to this power and also influence in the world behind the scenes. And there's a bit of a mystery going on, and it's very cutthroat and dark. And it was one of those situations where I connected so much to the main character. And I actually had the fortune of running into Alexis Henderson at BookCon, and we were talking about how this is just something I want to end on, but like this idea that a lot of times, when we have a character who's struggling mentally in a book, especially in like fantasy or where like that isn't like the main focus, a lot of people mistake sort of struggling mentally as a failure of someone's personality or character rather than them dealing with something very internal, and how sometimes that can seem like come off as passivity to other people, or being lazy or all these
Hmm.
different things that people with mental illness or struggling mentally
Yeah.
deal with. But yeah, I think, you know, finding that empathy for people and understanding that there's so much that goes on for people behind the scenes that you cannot see, like remembering that is super important.
Super important. And I think a beautiful message to end on of just like, yeah, give yourself a little grace, give other people some grace,
Mm.
and also consider like when you first pass judgment on a character, start with
Mhm.
simple terms. Don't even go with like people you know. When you pass judgment on a character, look at that a second time and just go like, wait, but what's happening here? And
Mhm.
and see if you can unlock a little bit of like a new skill set by doing that.
Mhm. Yeah, understanding that, everyone's different and everyone's going through a different journey and something behind the scenes. Yeah.
Well, Jananie, thank you again for being with me today and
Thank you
for
for having me.
yeah, we got vulnerable, we got some great rags, all good stuff.
Mhm.
Friends, make sure you're subscribed or following the show. You won't want to miss next week where we're celebrating the Magic Treehouse with Mary Pope Osborne on Monday, and then sharing books that take you out of time, place on Thursday. Happy reading! You can sample and borrow the books from today's episode in the Libby app, or if you're a librarian, find them for purchase in Overdrive Marketplace. Book Lounge by Libby is a proud Evergreen Podcast signature program. Explore more amazing shows at evergreenpodcasts.com. This podcast is produced and recorded by me, Joe Skelly, with editing by Andrew Alonso. Our theme music is High Five by Rex Banner, used with permission. Book Lounge by Libby is presented by the Libby app. Learn more at libbylife.com/booklounge.